Hi, in this video we are going to insert our canvas into our half scale jacket and pad stitch the lapel and baste it in so that we can then secure it to our pocket and close up that shoulder. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I have the correct pieces. So this is the wrong side of my canvas. It goes towards the body, and this is going to be opened up and placed into the jacket just like so. You want to match up your armhole, your shoulder, and your neckline, and then you're going to also match up that dart. So everything should align in here perfectly. So hopefully you can see that. And then I'm going to baste down my dart so that I can keep this in place right down that dart line. So I'm just going to use a long running stitch. I have a fairly long length of thread because I'm going to be making very large stitches with one little back tack there so that I end up not pulling it out until I'm ready to. So again, just make sure everything's lined up. You should be able to feel that on the underside of this that you're catching your stitches. Okay, so on my right side, I only have like tiny little stitches here. You can do this from the right side. My first one, I just like to make sure I do it from the wrong side. That way I can make sure that all my seam allowance or my cut edges are lined up. Okay, so these are my tailor tacks to put in a hip pocket. I'm not going to be doing that on this miniature, so they're not needed. I already did my welt pocket here, and this is my roll line for my lapel. Okay, so before you do your pad stitching on your collar, just make sure that all your seam allowances are marked. Mine are 1/2 inch, so I marked that. I did not get my seam allowance marked before I pad stitched the upper canvas to the canvas, and my stitches went past my stitching line, so I did a little bit extra across here, and those will all be cut off when I trim down my seam allowance. Okay, so I'm going to fold this back, and I'm going to do this way so you can see it. You're going to carefully roll this back, and you want to expose your pocket bag to your and your canvas so that you can see the two together. And then you're going to take a needle and thread, and you're going to whip stitch those together. So I'm just going to make sure my thread is correct, and you just want it flat and smooth, and this is how you secure your pocket to your canvas. So I'm just anchoring again my stitch, and then just doing basically short, oops, I went under my thread there, it's like a short basting, but this is not temporary. This is going to stay in. If you wax your thread, which I have not done, it will behave better. So getting some beeswax and running your thread over the beeswax, and then running the iron over it kind of sets it. Because this is a lapel welt, it should be narrow enough, and the canvas should be wide enough that I will do this on both sides of my pocket bag. And then I'm just going to anchor it with an extra tack there and secure it in place. Then I'm going to place this back, and then I'm going to on the waistline, I'm just going to baste across here. Again, just with a whip stitch, a little anchor stitch there, to about an inch before my edge here, because I don't want to get into my seam allowance. So that's just going to secure it there. We're going to be doing a lot of basting of this canvas to hold it in place before we stitch everything else on this. So just make sure that the canvas stays where it's supposed to, that dart stays lined up and everything. Okay, so now on this side, I'm also going to attach my pocket bag. Now you can see that the pocket bag does not, or I don't have enough canvas underneath the pocket bag to do the whole thing, but I could do a little here and a little here. Now again, I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, so I can't go too far because I'll be trimming that off later. But I could do a little here and a little here. So I'm just going to bring this up a little closer to the camera. And again, it's just a tack stitch at the beginning. You can knot it, but sometimes fabrics are very thin and this knot could press through, so you want to avoid doing the knots so that they don't show on the right side of the fabric. Okay, so I have tacked this on this side, and then I'm just going to again tack the bottom. If you don't have pockets, you would skip this step. And then if you have any sort of dart or you can baste instead of doing it to the pocket, you can actually baste this dart seam allowance right to the canvas as well. So that is another option. So since I don't have a hip dart, or hip pocket, I will just baste the dart to the canvas down here. And since I basted I basted right next to this dart, it's a little tight, and I already did that side one, it's a little tight. So ideally you would do this before you did that waistline basting. Okay, so once you have that in place, tack it and trim it. Okay, so I've secured it to the canvas on the bottom of the dart. I've secured it on either side of the pocket, and I have basted it up the center and across the waist here. The next step is to baste down like halfway between the edge here and your dart. So I'm just going to go from the top down, again doing very long whip stitches. Straight down. I'm stopping about my hem width away. And if you have room, do another one just inside the seam allowance line. Again to the hemline. I didn't have enough thread to do a tack, so I'm just going to let that one go. But I have 3 rows of basting there, so I'm okay. Now I've threaded multiple needles, so I can just keep going. You then want to kind of smooth out your fabric onto that canvas. Just make sure you're keeping your dart shaping, and you're going to then baste up from this towards the shoulder. Again, I'm just going to tack it. So in between this row of basting and your roll line. Again, stopping before your seam allowances at the top. Okay, the next step is to mark my roll line. So I'm going to do that on the right side of the fabric. And so I've already thread traced it, but I want to chalk mark this, or mark it in a way that it's going to show up really well later. So I'm just going to use my iron off pen. I don't really trust iron off pens because they don't usually come off everything, but in this case I'm willing to do it for my sample. So I've marked my roll line there, and then I'm going to baste up that roll line just through the canvas and the fashion fabric. And then you can remove your thread tracing after. And this roll line doesn't go like right to the edge here, it goes inside the edge. Usually your seam allowance distance in, but mine is a little off, but I'm gonna let it go just to show you what happens later. All right. And I pulled that a little tight when I was trying to get this knot out, so now I have to loosen it up a bit. Those thread traces can come out. Okay, so you can see my roll line there. All right, so then another bit of basting goes in just down the side around the armhole a little bit and then down here. So we're basically trying to follow the shape of this little part where it goes underneath the armhole. So we're going to copy that shaping, and you just want to smooth your fabric to the side like this. So I'm just going to baste in here. Hope I have enough thread. Kind of close to the armhole, but not completely. Under to make sure, so I'm feeling that I'm catching my canvas there underneath the armhole, and then I'm just going to go back anchoring it towards the center again, and I'm out of thread, so tie that off and get another piece. So I had about 6 needles worth of thread, and as you can see I'm already out, so I'm going to pause and thread a bunch again. Okay, so I'm just going to baste down this chest cavity. So again, about this far away, so like I was this far away over here, about this far away over here down the canvas. So you want to feel where the canvas is. So my edge of the canvas is here, so I'll actually be here. So I just came down, I went under the armhole, and then I'm going back over so I can follow it down along my dart. So again, I'm just whip stitching / basting this down my canvas. And I'm just feeling, make sure I'm catching my canvas on the wrong side. And again, I'm stopping above my hemline. Okay. Then if you want, you can mark your seam allowance line. So I just put a few little dots there, and I just want to baste just inside my seam allowance so that when I trim off my seam allowance, it does not get cut off, the basting. And on a much larger scale jacket, these stitches would be further apart. Right. Okay, so now you can hopefully see that, so we did our basting down the front, across the waist, down and down, then up, and we're always smoothing out and up and all of this as we're going. Just make sure you're not flattening that dart so that both the canvas and the jacket darts are together there, and you'll end up with like a little pucker here because that's where it goes in the waist. Down and down, and then up the armhole. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 with the roll line, 7 coming down, and then 8 going up into the armhole. I'm now going to flip this over, and if I had a welt pocket, remember we couldn't secure it all the way over to here, so I would have done a stitch across here. You could do a herringbone stitch, or also known as a cross stitch, to the pocketing itself across here, and I could do the same thing across the pocketing up here, but because I was able to secure it in a couple places, I'm not too worried about it. And then that would be it for attaching the canvas to the jacket at this time, and then the next step would be to pad stitch the lapel. Now sometimes the lapel is taped, so you would also mark your lapel roll line on this side. So one way to do that is to place, so because I'm right-handed, so I'll show you this way. So I'm going to replace my ruler on here like this, and with a piece of chalk, and I'm going to use chalk that I know doesn't come out, but that I'll be able to see. So I have some yellow chalk here. It does not come out, so make sure you're not putting this on the side of the garment that will ever be seen. But I just want you to clearly see that I have placed a line here, so hopefully you can see that yellow roll line. That's the disadvantage of the markers, and the marker works pretty good for that, but the pens do not. So I'm just going to go back over it with my pen, and hopefully that shows up well enough on the camera. So sometimes the roll line is taped with a bit of twill tape across here. So you want something that is strong and stable, and sometimes it's also taped across here. So down here, they use 3/8 of an inch twill tape. So this is twill tape. It has that herringbone stitch on it, and this is the 3/8 of an inch twill tape. So you can see that herringbone, but this is way too big for my project. So I have some other stabilizer tape that I can cut in half and make it a little bit narrower for my project, but it's still stable enough so to use. So this is just a woven stay tape. And I need a piece that's not about 2/3 the length of my lapel. So I'm just gonna guess here about how long that is. And I'm trying to just cut it exactly in half so that if I were to do this on both sides of my jacket, you could see how it would be done. Okay. So, and then this would just be placed. So this is the lapel side, and I'm actually going to place it on the outside of my lapel roll line. And I'm going to pin this in place at the top, and then you're going to give it just a gentle pull here, shortening this area of the chest. This helps it lay just a little bit better in the on the body. And so just a ever so slight pull, and then you sew it with it just a little, with that eased in. So you're making the top half of the lapel roll line just a little smaller, and then the bottom of this, you can tape it, but don't stretch it, or you can cut it off, you know, about, like I said, about 2/3, and then have nothing in the roll line here, and then it just allows it to turn and roll nicely. And then this piece could be placed across here like this. So I'm just gonna grab a couple pins, and the extra would just be trimmed off, but right now I'm just gonna leave it intact. And then I'm going to baste this down. So when you're basting this, make sure this basting does come out so you can go through all layers, including the fashion fabric. But when you're sewing it down, you're not going to go through all the layers because you don't want it to show on the, I mean, it's not going to show because it's going to fold back like this, but you don't want it to, you don't want to be flipping this collar up and see any stitches. So you're going to try to make them as small, like a prick stitch, as small as possible. All right, so I got my basting thread, and so I'm just going to baste this in place. Again, just make sure it stays just outside of your roll line when you're basting this on. Take that pin out now that I've basted where I need to there. I did wax it, but it's still misbehaving a bit just because it's such fine, thin thread. Okay, so continue basting my line here. Right into that seam allowance for now. Like wrapped it around that pin, and then give myself a back stitch. And then I'm just going to rotate and baste it around this line, but I'm not going to baste here because I don't really need that. It's just here where the two cross. And I'm going to cut that little loop I made, so I'm just going to do a tack stitch here just to make sure it stays. Cut that loop so it doesn't accidentally cause me problems later. And then a back stitch here. trim that down so that's not in my way. And then I have that all basted in place. Okay, so now I'm going to, so there's a few different stitches you can use to sew this in. You can do a prick stitch, which means that you are going to go into the fabric and take the tiniest little stitch into the jacket here. It should look like a little tiny pucker in the fabric. You shouldn't actually see any thread showing. You could do a herringbone stitch. So that is where you do your X's, like a cross stitch across. Or you could do a whip stitch up one side and down the other. For me, my fastest stitch, I think, is my herringbone or cross stitch. So that's the one that I'm going to use. And it is worked from, instead of sewing like this way from right to left, because I'm right-handed, I'll be stitching left to right. And so I'm going to try to get through all layers of the canvas and that stays tape, but not through to my fashion fabric. And because I cut this, it's a little bit fraying on this edge, but so you don't let your needle go all the way through. So my stitches are about 3/8 of an inch apart, and I'm going in. So I'm sewing from right to left, but my needle's going in from, I'm sewing from left to right, but my needle's going in from right to left, which creates little crosses on the stitches. I think when I rethread, I'll change color so that it's more obvious what the stitches are doing. But this is making little X's, and so each stitch is quite short, like I mentioned, only 3/8 of an inch. But it gives a nice secure stitch for this stay tape. This is also my favorite stitch for hand hemming things so that it doesn't show, because it also finishes the edge at the same time, so it's less likely to fray and get your toes caught in hems and things like that if you're doing pants. Or on the jacket, it's a nice clean stitch, both for the sleeve and the hem. If you're left-handed, you're going to work this from right to left, and your needle will be going in from left to right. Okay, when I get to the end, I just made a really tiny set of stitches, and then I am just back tacking a few times because I'm not knotting this. Okay, so I'm going to just switch to a brighter color before I do the top half of that. So hopefully you can see it better. Okay, so again, I'm just going into my stay tape and my canvas. I'm trying not to get through to my fashion fabric. Or if I do, I just want the tiniest prick, not anything that's going to show the thread. I did not wax this, so it's tangling on me, but hopefully that will help. So this tape can be put on before or after you pad stitch the lapel. I kind of like it before just because it gives it some definition. And I did a lousy job going through the canvas there, so I have to go back and do it again. And then here is the edge of my seam allowance, so I'm going to stop there and do my back tack. Now I do not have to stop and cut this off. I could just start doing my pad stitching, but I need to mark my pad stitching lines first. So my pad stitching on this is going to be about every, because it's such a small scale, I'm going to do every 1/4 inch, but on a full-size garment, this would be more like every 3/8 of an inch. You could even do it further than that, like 1/2 inch apart, but it just depends on the type of fabric you have. And then when you get to the like towards the tip here, then you're going to do them closer together. So here I'm doing them very close, and there, so here I did 1/4, here I'm doing just a scant 1/4. And now I'm going to start pad stitching up this line here. So pad stitching, I just barely feel the prick of the needle on my finger. If you see the needle, you've gone too far. You want to just barely catch that fabric, which is really hard to do because I'm working with a cotton here. If you're working with anything other than a very thin woven, it's much easier to do this. So, and ideally I would be pad stitching from the roll line towards this, not this way. So I'm going to cut this off and start over, because otherwise your fabric can form a bubble and we don't want that. Okay, so I'm going to go right up this line here, and again so I can just barely see the glint of my needle, so I've gone too far. Usually if you feel the prick of the needle on your finger, you just bring it out right away, and you can get it without catching or showing too much of the fashion fabric, or the thread on the fashion fabric side. But like I said, this really thin cotton makes it very difficult, and every time I'm catching just the ever so slightest little bit. So I'm trying to do these about 3/8 of an inch apart, right at my line. And so if you look, the fabric is curling over my fingers, and that's exactly what we want it to do as we're pad stitching. I'm making sure that I don't have this in my hand, I have the lapel in my hand, because it makes it a lot easier for me to hold it and curl it over my fingers. Because what I'm trying to do is create a roll. I'm trying to shorten the fashion fabric and use the longer canvas side. And I'm going to stop here, right where my seam allowance line is, and then jump way back up here, and continue back down the other side. So yes, I'm trying to ever so slightly shorten the fashion fabric and use the longer canvas fabric to create a roll or a curvature of the lapel so that it hugs the body better and wants to lay flat against the chest as you're wearing that. So I can show you as soon as I get to the top here that you'll see that I have not been successful keeping the stitches invisible, but I have done as best as I can for this cotton without taking the entire day to do it. So I can feel the fabric in my hand. I'm taking my fingers and I'm kind of just smoothing it as I reposition my fingers. So you should end up, it's like, see how it was lined up, but now that the blue is peeking out just a little bit, and then that should get a little bit more with each passing. Like, not a lot, just a slight shift. And I'm going to go all the way up to the top and then over and back down again. But so on this side, I hope you can see, I have tiny little pricks. Sometimes I did better than others where I have a prick, but the pink doesn't show as much, and here, but sometimes you can definitely see the pink. Like I said, if this is a heavier fabric, these little pricks won't show, and I can just catch like one thread of the fabric, but this is a very densely woven cotton, so it makes it really hard to do that. But you can see already that the collar is curling up, which is a good sign that when I press it, it will want to stay pressed down and in place like it's supposed to. Okay, so I'm going to finish this and then we'll continue. So I'm almost done here. I just want to remind you that when you get closer to the point, you are doing lines that are a little bit closer together, and so your stitches should be a little bit shorter. So instead of doing 3/8, try to do 1/4. So I'm just going to do my last few. Then my tack stitch, back stitch, so that I can secure that. Okay, so there is my finished pad stitch lapel that's been taped. So you can then see, we'll take that to the ironing board and we'll give that a gentle steam, and then that will encourage this to stay back and flat. So now I'm going to just press this from the canvas side, and then I'm just going to press that in, and then I'm going to press the chest piece a little bit. You also want to take the time to trim out your seam allowance all the way around, even at the bottom where the hem is. So you're going to reduce or cut off an inch off the hem for this jacket, and then 1/2 inch seam allowances all the way around. So that would be next after you've pressed this. So I'm just letting this cool a little bit before I pick it up. And then I can trim it. So grab some scissors here and show you the trimming. So just make sure you're not cutting your jacket, and you're going to cut right next to your tape that we put on. Accidentally ironed off my marker, so I am guessing right there. And I'll have to trim these threads in order to get this loose and off. So there we go. Okay, and then, like I mentioned, I re-pad stitched across here. You can barely see it, it's light blue thread, because I'm cutting across this where I accidentally pad stitched too far. And then I'll cut the canvas down around the armhole. There's a little bit of my pocket there, but when I stitch this, or it wouldn't normally be that close to your seam allowance line. Okay, so now see that I have trimmed the seam allowance all around the armhole, shoulder, and neckline, and now I'm going to do the same thing up the front, and then I'll have to measure the bottom to give myself a 1-inch hem from the bottom of the fashion fabric, not from the bottom of the canvas, because my canvas has been stretched and pulled down a little bit, so it's a little longer than what I actually needed, but that's okay. So just repositioning my hand so I can really feel underneath to make sure I'm not cutting my fashion fabric. And here again, I ironed off my lines, so I'm going based off of my pad stitching and eyeballing it a little bit. Knock the camera over. Okay, so that would be, whoops, my finished trimming of the center front. And then I'm going to measure up from the hem here and mark off, so 1 inch from where the blue ends, not where the canvas ends. I'm just marking it right there. Again, I can't quite see here, so I'm just using that. And again, I'm going to measure from the blue here. Okay, so then that gives me a nice line to cut that off. And it's okay if you cut off some of your dart, like you have reinforced that really well, so don't worry about that. If you have a double-breasted jacket, the under part of the jacket would be trimmed 1/8 of an inch shorter. The canvas would be trimmed 1/8 of an inch shorter because the hem on the jacket side would be 1/8 of an inch shorter. Okay, just gonna clean that up a little bit. There we go. Okay. So that is my finished and trimmed front, and then with the canvas attached and my lapel pad stitched, you can then give this a gentle press like so. Just rotate the camera around here so we can get to that view. And then, so I'm going to just place that right on my roll line and give it a little steam on the top, upper half of the lapel. And I'm not pushing down hard on the bottom, I'm just giving it some steam. And so you can see now that that is nicely pressed and ready to have the shoulders sewn together. So I've already stitched that, so I can just simply place these two together and sew them so that they fit perfectly together. So my cut edges are even there, and then my 1/2 inch seam allowance down is where these two need to be crossing, so they aren't an exact fit. Right here there's a little gap, but at 1/2 inch down, that's where they need to touch. And then I'll sew this 1/2 inch seam allowance across, and then I'll stay stitch the neckline so it doesn't get stretched out, so I can apply the collar. Okay, so I'm at the machine and I have just pinned this so that my raw edges are even here and that my 1/2 inch below this edge, these two pieces cross. So I'm just going to place this into my machine and I've just taped my 1/2 inch seam allowance line. I find my students really find that helpful when they cannot figure out which one's which. So if you're not sure, use a seam gauge. So from the needle over, that's my 1/2 inch line. Okay, so I'm just going to back stitch to start. And I'm stitching right next to the canvas. Taking my pins out as I go. And keep your raw edges even, otherwise your stitching is going to be off. Take that out at the very last second. And then you would repeat that on the other shoulder. So you should see that you have no puckers that are actually sewn in. I did not hold my threads at the very beginning, so it kind of got ugly there, but I did backstitch, so I know that it's secure. So cut those loops without any problems because I know I backstitched it. Trimming my threads over here as well. Okay, so now I would take this to my ironing board and I'm going to press just the seam allowance, just like in the previous videos, but not into the back of the jacket because I don't want to lose that bit of easing that I just created. So here I am at the ironing board and just right into over the seam, no more than 1/2 inch into the jacket itself. So a little bit of steam to soften it, heat to set it, and then the ripples are nearly gone. Then that will create a bit of a bubble or curvature for the back shoulder area. And then I'd press this on my ham to continue encouraging this to be curved. Again, don't press the back of your jacket flat. You want to use the ham in order to keep that smooth. And then we're going to stay stitch. So stay stitching is when I stitch 1/8 of an inch less than my seam allowance. So I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to do 3/8 of an inch from the shoulder to the center back, 3/8 of an inch from the shoulder towards the center front, and then I would repeat that on my other piece. So at the machine, I'm just going to sew 3/8 of an inch. So if I need to pivot a little bit to stay on my 3/8 line, just make sure your needle is down, lift your foot, turn your fabric, and then lower your foot and continue. You can definitely stay stitch from this side. You don't have to do it from the right side of the fabric. So you can flip your fabric over to do the front and you can overlap. You don't need to really backstitch, but do trim your threads and make it tidy. You don't want a big threaded mess. So needle down, turn, and I'm looking like right here. That's where I'm maintaining that seam allowance. If you look too far forward or too far back, that's not where you're sewing. Like, you want to be right in line with your needle where you're looking. Otherwise, you can end up getting way off on your seam allowance. Repeat that on the other side. So I wanted to show you a quick, easy way you can add stay tape to the collar roll line, the lapel line on your half scale jacket. So again, for the quicker, easier method, but if you want to have that stay tape, you can actually zigzag stitch this because it's not going to show because it's going to be on the underside of the lapel when it's flipped. So I'm just going to show you that now. So the first thing I'm going to do is you just want to make sure you're pinning this in place just like you did with your other one. So I pinned it in the upper area here, just outside my lapel roll line, and I'm giving the tape just a gentle pull to create just a slight bit of easing on the fashion fabric side down to about 2/3 down. So I have just a little bit of tightness here on my tape, which then allows me to ease it in. Okay, then I am going to still baste it in place, and I did put another one in, and this one's just going right on the seam allowance line, and it will be clipped past this, and this will be clipped here because we'll be cutting or you'll be stitching on that seam allowance line. So the next step I'm going to do is just baste this in place. Now I'm going to be sewing this on with a zigzag on the machine, a zigzag stitch on the machine. My length is set at 2 millimeters and my width is set at 3.5. So I'm just going to whip stitch this, whip stitch this on so that I can then take it to the machine. A little bit more running stitch than whip stitch, only because I'm doing a zigzag stitch to sew it. And then I want to make sure that it doesn't get caught and I can take it out easily. So just make sure that your stay tape, so I used 3/8 inch stay tape, and for my sample I cut it in half because it was too wide for this size of jacket because I'm doing the half scale jacket. But normally you would use 3/8 inch stay tape. Twill tape works great, and that's the one with the herringbone pattern on it. Or you can buy stay tape at fabric stores or online. And then, like I said, I'm going to stop here right at this intersection where the two of them cross, because I know that I won't be needing it past that point. So I'm just going to do a tack stitch there. So I'm going to take all these pins out because they're no longer needed. So very careful, I might be able to make this go as far as I need. So as I stitch that, I just use my hands to manipulate the fabric and ease in the extra that was underneath, which will then be sewn permanently in place when I do that zigzag stitch. Okay, and then this just goes to the seam allowance edge over here. So that is my quick and easy basting for that. And now I can take this and trim off that extra stay tape that's going past where I don't need it. So here and here. And then I can take that to the machine and do a zigzag stitch down. Now again, it's not going to it'll show on this side of the fabric, but because the lapel will be rolled over like this, you won't see it. So we're at the machine, and I'm just going to place this in the machine, just making sure that I can get in under there. I'm going to line this up so it's centered down my line. Make sure you get your thread caught in there. And I've already set this up, like I mentioned, for a zigzag stitch with a 2 millimeter stitch length and a 3.5 millimeter width. So I cannot see myself, so I'm just move that so I can see. If you have a stay stitch feature, or sorry, a lock stitch feature on your machine, then you would push that button now. I don't have that on this machine, so I'm actually going to reduce my length and my width down to nothing and just do 3 stitches in place and then put it all back up to my 2 mil length and my 3.5 width, and then mention just center that and then go straight down my line. Now I have the fashion fabric on the bottom because that's the one that I'm easing into the one on top. And normally you would match your thread as closely as possible with this. And I can go a little bit past, and then I'll do another lock stitch and then take it out. Give my little threads a clip. Okay, so on the back side, you can see that, but again, it'll just be inside the roll, and that just gives it a little bit of definition for it to fold on. This is a bit stiffer than the hand sewn one. So again, I'm going to just do a lock stitch. That's about 3 stitches with the needle or with the fabric not moving. And back to my 2 length, my 3.5 width. And then I will just go around this curvature and lock stitch it again. Alright, and then hopefully you can easily pull out your basting. Grab my seam ripper here. Get underneath there and pull it out. So you no longer need that basting. Now this basting, or this line, is my roll line that I thread tacked in place. So that one I'm going to keep for a little longer because I need it for when I go to press it. But that is how it should look on the outside of your fabric, and then on the inside of your fabric. So at the ironing board, just give that a gentle press right on that roll line, just to ease in your fashion fabric to that roll line. So that, and again, a little steam, hold it, let it dry, and then let it cool. And then you can gently steam your roll line, right on the roll line. Giving it a bit more crease up here, a little bit less down there. All right, so that is what the fast and easy method would look like. We don't have to do anything else with this. The whole point of this is to expedite the construction process. I have my 2 halves now, so now I'm going to pin the center backs, and I can finish stay stitching the neckline, as I have not done that yet, to my speed tailor method side of my jacket yet. So I'm going to just make sure, if you have any notches, you would match those up. If you have any dots, you would match those up. The neck should match up here. The hem should match down here. Pin it so that all of your edges, your raw edges, are even. And so then you can stitch that together with your 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I pin this so that I'll be stitching from the bottom up. Directional sewing is important for some things, and you may want to be mindful of that. So if I were wanting to sew this from the top down, I would pin the other side of the fabric because I want my pins on top so I can see them as I go. Now I need to switch back to my straight stitch, and I like a stitch length of 3 for just my everyday sewing, so it's easy to take out if I need to. 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way across, and just keep an eye that your edges are staying together. I'm just going to program my machine so the needle always stops down, so I don't have to make it do that every time. It's a nice feature. It's like a third hand. Stop before you get to the pin. And I ran out of bobbin thread, so we'll start over. Okay, so I have bobbin thread back in there. So just be mindful that you're starting exactly on top of your line. Like if you need to, check to see if your needle's gonna hit that line. If it's not, if it's like over here, whatever, make sure it's gonna hit. And then you wanna overlap your stitches. I like to overlap them about 2.5 centimeters or an inch. Then I'm not back stitching as much. So I just do a little overlap, a quick back stitch, and then I just continue on as if I never ran out. There's a little bit of curvature here, which is why this center back isn't on a fold. Give that a clip there. Make sure you clip where you ran out. And here as well. Just keeping your threads neat. So now I have finished sewing my center back seam, and I'll press that open. As I mentioned, this center back seam is not straight. It has a little bit of curvature, so I've gone ahead and gotten my ham, and then I will press it on the ham. So there's curvature at the hip a little bit, and then it goes in at the waist a bit. So I want to make sure that I'm just using the tip of my iron there, not creating unnecessary wrinkles. And then a bit of curvature up in the shoulder blade neck area. So this would normally be just to accommodate those shoulder blades in your neck. That might be more pronounced if you have a forward head position. Okay, so I'm very pleased with the way that's turning out. So that looks good. Front and back. And now I'm going to stay stitch the one side so that it doesn't stretch, and I'm going to repeat that on this side. So with my 1/2 inch seam allowances, you stay stitch 1/8 inch less than that. So I'm going to stitch at 3/8 of an inch from the shoulder to the center and from the shoulder to the center. So never go all the way around. That will stretch and distort that neck opening, and then it will never look nice. So because I need to do it from the shoulder to the center, I'll be sewing from the wrong side on this side. So just make sure you're doing it 1/8 of an inch less than what your seam allowance is. So I'm going to pivot just to make sure that right here, adjacent to my needle, I am sewing at 3/8. And you can overlap a little bit from what you did before. And then I would flip it and sew it from the shoulder towards the center front. Again, with 3/8. And again, you can overlap it a little bit. Trim up my threads, and then we are ready for the next step. All right, so it's totally fine that I have bobbin thread on one side and needle thread on the other, and I'm just using 2 different colors so that you can tell on my project what's what. So any degree from minimal to max you can do on your tailored garments, your tailored jacket. So that is the end of this video. I have added my canvas, I've added my stay tape, I basted everything, part of the canvas to my jacket, pad stitched my lapel, and then did my stay after I joined the shoulders with that bit of E-stitching to make them fit properly, and stitched down my center back seam. We would start assembling and preparing your under collar for pad stitching and then to be sewn onto the jacket.